Mike Green, I'm here for Real Vision. I'm really excited to sit down with my good friend Chris Balding. Chris is back from Vietnam. For those of the CCP watching, we have him safe currently, so you cannot have him. Chris, welcome back to Real Vision. Let's get right into it and start talking about what's going on in your world.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm back in California, so I'm sporting my California hoodie, and basically just trying to make life difficult at the moment for the CCP.
Well, you're doing an incredible job. So first, just this quick background, you're a Fulbright, you're associate professor at the Fulbright University in Vietnam, correct?
Well, kind of. So part of my recent work, I was actually advised by a couple of people in Vietnam and some different governments that it would probably be advisable for me to leave Vietnam. I should say, that's not because of Vietnam. Thoroughly enjoyed Vietnam and the place I worked, but I'm actually no longer working at their, but that's not their fault. So I'm back in the U.S. now, and we'll just see what happens.
So this is a permanent return. I was unaware of that, and that's fantastic. Now, when I say that's fantastic, again, I was semi-serious when I said you're safe from the CCP, but that really is a legitimate concern because you've done some groundbreaking work in terms of revealing the extent to which the Chinese Communist Party has been engaged in intelligence collection efforts around the world, not just for the United States, but for Australia, India, the UK, even Canada makes the list. Can you share with us some of the recent work that you've done on this database? I believe the company is Zhenhua.
Yeah, so basically this was a company that appears to be engaging in the same type of behavior, but on a much larger scale as to like a Cambridge Analytica. China has basically said that they're engaging in, let's say, various types of information or hybrid warfare. They have entire government agencies that are dedicated to this. They have branches of the PLA. And this specific company, what they're doing is they were building effectively a massive database on foreign nationals and institutions around the world. And so we got a hold of this database, and this company openly talked about how they were the front edge of information warfare. And so in this database, the individuals and institutions that they were targeting, we don't know the exact rules or, let's say, algorithms that they were using to determine who got into the database. But we can absolutely say that there were clear patterns. Politicians, the families of politicians, and not just the politicians that you would expect to be in, an intelligence database, like, the Trump and the Trump family are surely in intelligence databases around the world, but politicians at all levels of government in many countries. And the family members and extended family members of those politicians, of mayors in small towns and things like that. If you are involved in the tech sector in lots of countries and in almost any capacity, there's a good chance that you're in this database. And so I think what was noticeable to us was first of all the breadth of this database. In how many people it collected in specific sectors. And then I think also what was noticeable was how they knitted this all together.
Hi, I'm Raoul Pal. Sorry to interrupt your video, I know it's a pain in the arse, but look, I want to tell you something important. I can tell that you really want to learn about what's going on in financial markets and understand the global economy in these complicated times. That's what we do at Real Vision. So this YouTube channel is a small fraction of what we actually do. You should really come over to realvision.com and see the 20 or so videos a week that we produce of this kind of quality of content, the deep analysis and understanding of the world around us. So if you click on the link below or go to realvision.com, it costs you $1 to get a month's access to this incredible treasure trove. I don't think you can afford to be without it.
Into a very, very comprehensive database. And really what it kind of looked like to us is if they were drawing up lists of targets. in the sense that there was some type of scoring mechanism so that everybody was scored. People were classified in, degrees of importance and things like that. And it even had ranking. It even had classifications for a lot of people, for instance, on being politically exposed. And as someone from our team talked about, the only time they had seen this type of classification before was in like bank customer relation management software. So that, for instance, if you were the brother-in-law of an elected official or something like that, it would flag you if you wanted to make $1 million deposit as potentially being politically exposed, as protection for corruption or money laundering type of situations. And so we don't know where they got that specific data. Because that had only been seen. We believe that there's one commercial provider that sells to smaller banks for that, but larger banks develop their own databases, to the best of our knowledge, for this specific type of data. So it clearly also has non-public data, but it was kind of interesting that in a very short period of time, they could very clearly put together a very detailed profile of institutions or individuals that they wanted to target, and discover weak links in areas that they wanted to target.
So now when you talk about this type of database, I think most people would immediately default to, well, this is LinkedIn, right? Or this is something along these lines. But then you start bringing in the dynamics of family members. You start bringing in the dynamics of related parties, credit scoring type systems, et cetera. I mean, it brings to mind the sort of extensive databases that were uncovered in the Stasi in East Germany, or others, but those tended to be focused on their own population. We know that China has an extensive component of that, but this was really a database that appears to have been constructed for the purposes of targeting or gaining influence over individuals that are either politically connected or have a role in a technology supply chain. And so it represents a troubling development in terms of realizing that this type of active coordinated targeting is going on. Some might push back and say, well, the U.S. does the same thing. Do you think that's true? Do you think that's a reasonable retort?
So the two aligned arguments that I've seen is that, well, like Facebook or Google gather this type of data on individuals. And Facebook and Google and those types of companies do have a lot of data about us as individuals. I think one very important aspect here is that Facebook and Google, they're trying to sell you an Amazon Prime account, or that pair of shoes that you were looking at last week. They clearly have very different intentions and motivations for selling you for what they're trying to accomplish on why they're gathering data. Well, the other thing is well, why would doesn't the U.S. government gather data on this? I've never worked inside the U.S. government. I don't know specifically what the U.S. government gathers. From the conversations I've had, they definitely would target, let's say, senior foreign leadership, senior foreign military, things like that. Maybe even senior business leaders. CEOs at companies around the world. I think what is unique about what China is doing is simply the hoovering up of such a broad amount of personal information for people around the world. One of the things, just to give you an example, was there were some institutions that they clearly, for whatever reason, had targeted as important institutions. In this, they had personal profiles of even just secretaries in these institutions. So it's clearly not just, hey, we're going to keep a record of the CEO of a key company, the president of a country, a general, that type of information. But it is clearly hoovering up information of places that they want to target down to very low levels within an organization.
So one of the things that caught my attention that came up in an article that referenced this was some of the language that was used by this company. And one line in particular caught my attention. I'm just going to read it as a direct quote from the article. But This was pulled from their website in the recruiting process where they were trying to hire database engineers to look at it. And it said social media can manipulate reality and weaken a country's administrative, social, military, or economic forces. This may lead to internal conflicts, social polarization, and radicalism in a country. And that's an extraordinary recruiting line, right? To me, that is so transparent and so concerning in its underlying character. And yes, we all know that the CIA has conducted operations in minor countries, but this is occurring on a broad scale, as I mentioned, across Australia, the UK, the United States. India in particular was targeted, obviously not on a population basis, but on a proportionate basis. It was very important. Vietnam, for example, you mentioned there's key individuals there. So this is really an extraordinary effort that was underway.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is not well understood is I'm sure that people like Xi or Vladimir Putin probably have their preferred candidates that they would rather deal with. But I think one thing that gets lost in this conversation about who China, Russia, or other countries might prefer as the leader of the U.S. or other countries is what they really want to accomplish is to stir up chaos, dissension, and distrust in the entire system of democracy. So, like when we hear like Chinese media talk about Corona and things like that. What they're talking about is, look, China did it better than democracies. This is the new way. And so, yes, I don't doubt that Xi or people like Putin have their preferred candidate, but their real target is sowing doubt and dissension about the entire system.
Yeah, I think that's very clear. And I mean, I've been very publicly on record in terms of speaking about the strength of the American system from a geographic standpoint, in terms of our unique situation, basically controlling our own island. The way you defeat us is causing dissension. The way, we have to break apart internally for any real threat. So let's actually switch seats for a second and put on the American in Vietnam, similar to the American in Paris, watching from afar and seeing what you're seeing. Are they succeeding?
I mean, so I'll be honest in saying, not having really lived in the United States for 11 years, but, still having very close ties and friends and family here, as kind of an outsider, I mean, it really appears that they are. And, when I hear about, and when I see on social media and, read newspaper articles about the vitriolic arguments and dissension taking place, you just kind of want to throw up your hands and roll your eyes and say, I mean, is this really the hill and the argument that we're going to die on? And so it is kind of amazing to watch how vitriolic these arguments have gotten, how the dissension and distrust that has been sown. And I mean, it is kind of disappointing. And, I consider myself, in philosophical terms, a type of libertarian in the sense that, the government should stay out of the bedroom and the wallet in general terms. But I think, if you look at a lot of the debates that are taking place in America, people are effectively dying on rhetorical hills, and everything is the end of the world. Everything is the end of democracy, and it's really sad to see in a lot of ways.
So, as you come back here, right, and as you re-enter America as an outsider who's been away for 11 years. What would you see, or what do you see as ways that we can do a better job of being aware of how we're being manipulated, or how databases like this are influencing the discussion? And do you think these databases, I mean, is ultimately the arguments that are being put into social media, per the quote that I gave, manipulating reality? How do we step away from that? How do we gain the perspective of somebody who's sitting 3,500 miles away across an ocean?
So I think that there are a couple of things. One of the things is that We know that Russia, we know China, other countries, and just as a quick side note, we know for a fact that Huawei and China are doing a lot of cooperation on, cyber information warfare type of activities. They're actually cooperating quite significantly. But back to the question, one of the things is that I would say is, I think it's really important to turn down the rhetoric. And I'll just give you one of my personal pet peeves is, every day there is talk about, the democracy in America is dead. Okay. And I hear this argument, having lived in authoritarian countries for the past 11 years and surrounded by, authoritarian or mostly authoritarian countries, not entirely democratic countries. And I just kind of laugh at that notion. And I'll just give you an example. I mean, what authoritarian country impeaches their president? I mean, that's kind of nonsensical. Now, I think there's reasonable debates about the behavior that President Trump engaged in. There are. President Trump has lost frequently in the courts. He's won in the courts. Okay. Authoritarian governments, authoritarian leaders don't get impeached. Authoritarian leaders don't lose in the courts. So again, we can have these debates about the behavior he engaged in. We can have these debates about about the use of executive authority. Those are all valid debates. We had those debates in the Obama administration. Obama won; he lost in the courts. I think it is rhetorical flourish, and I think it's designed to engender impassioned responses about politics, about partisans, about leadership when we talk about things in that way, rather than saying, okay, what are the actual issues at play, and we immediately jump to charges like, well, democracy's dead. It's an authoritarian state. I mean, if every authoritarian state was this authoritarian, the world would be a lot better place.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually important. The way I try to frame it for my family, as they view social media and they view information, is I always say to them, why don't ask what you're seeing, or if it is true, even ask why you're seeing it and why it is being presented to you. And I would also encourage people, and this is hard for me as well, I'm obviously quite active on social media, step away from the social media itself and actually try to connect with people, right? Where you are able to have a conversation where you recognize how hostile your behavior, if you spoke to people the way that you do on social media, would be interpreted in a face-to-face interaction. And again, that's complicated by the dynamics of coronavirus, right? It's almost, you could argue that the behaviors around coronavirus and the choices that were made fit a lot of the characteristics and a lot of the designations that we're referring to in terms of designed to separate us and designed to cause chaos and discord. And so I encourage people just to stop and say, why am I being fed this? Why is it eliciting this reaction to me? And is that the reaction that I want to have in response to this?
And I'll also tell you, just as an example, one of the things that what was very interesting to me was, when you live in a foreign country, you're frequently asked about, especially as an American, you're asked about the politics of the United States. And, it's always very interesting. One of the things that, I would tell a lot of Americans is, and Vietnam is somewhat of an outlier. But, to be honest, Trump is, I think, quite popular in Vietnam. And there's a lot of complex reasons for that. There's overlapping reasons for that. But when you have to ask, when you have to answer questions from people about, specific policy issues, why is he doing that? Who do you think is, going to do this type of stuff? And you're trying to talk to somebody who's somewhat of an outsider, and you have to explain it almost in a nonpartisan, you're trying to explain something in a nonpartisan way. You have to think about issues in different ways. And and a lot of times they have an almost mechanical understanding of the United States, not having lived there. So in some ways, they actually know the system of government and which powers are delegated to which authorities better, though they may not understand the personalities as well. And so it definitely helps you work through those issues as to why you're being asked, why people have opinions the way they do when they're outsiders rather than having lived and grown up in that environment.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I actually think that is similar to what we were talking about before, just the ability to disassociate a little bit and think about what is the system in place and how you can approach that. When we think about the narrative that we're receiving, you mentioned that China has been focused on spreading a narrative that they did a better job of coronavirus and that this is a better path, right? That's reminiscent of communications that we received during the Great Depression, for example, that the communist path was the better path, right? That the Soviets were managing themselves better. And of course, we heard that at the exact same time that they were executing their own people in various purges, that there was starvation occurring on a wide scale. And so the data sets, the information that we receive, particularly as Americans, is often very poorly, because we're so far away, even in today's world of virtual transparency. When you deal with a country like China, what comes out is very rarely anti-state, right? You need to incorporate a perspective of a filter that is being applied. What do you think is actually happening in China now? What has changed in China over the past couple of years, particularly as it relates to what I would anticipate is a significant deterioration in their economy based on the dynamics of the global slowdown tied to coronavirus? This is a country that has been the manufacturer of the world in an environment in which there's been a massive global slowdown. What do you think is going on? What are you hearing?
So I think there's so many layers to that question.
Yeah.
So let me try and make sure that I hit all of them. One of the things is that I do think there is, let's say, a significant degree of nationalism in the country. It seems like almost like they're trying to both gin up the nationalism and also restrain it at the same time, in the sense with regards to Hong Kong. One of the things I think that is poorly understood, for instance, just to take Hong Kong as an example, the populace in China generally viewed Hong Kong as the spoiled child of the kind of broader Chinese family. And one of the things is that they always wondered, well, why would Hong Kongers protest to defend freedom of speech? That to the average man on the street in China, that honestly doesn't make sense. No. And the way to describe it is almost like, well, how do you explain 3 dimensions to someone who's only ever lived in 2 dimensions? It just doesn't make sense. Well, we're growing. We're a big country. Yeah, you're gonna get with the program. This is how it works. And I think you're seeing a similar dynamic. I think on play with Taiwan. There was a op-ed recently in the Global Times, which is a very nationalistic paper, that it was talking openly about war with Taiwan. And I think what was noticeable there was they were almost trying to restrain. It almost sounded like they were trying to restrain the forces in China that were urging war with Taiwan. Go invade Taiwan now. And I think that's an undercurrent. I think a lot of people significantly underestimate some type of conflict with Taiwan in the next, let's say, 2 years. And when we say conflict, that could mean everything from full-scale invasion to, a blockade to some type of, boat disaster or something like that. There's any number of things that could specifically mean. So I do think politically and externally, there's a lot of issues. You see it in India with the China-India border skirmish. There's a lot of issues like that I think they're trying to both push forward and restrain from becoming too large. Domestically, I think Xi is, there's a lot of pressure on Xi because I think at least within a lot of upper echelons, I think there's a lot of grumbling, but I think no one is willing to actually do anything for many reasons. I remember even before I left, there was, you heard crumbling, and people within the party seemed very scared, very, very concerned. Let's put it this way. If you told me tomorrow that, President Xi had been poisoned and was dead, that wouldn't surprise me. If he rules another 20 years, that also won't surprise me.
Yeah, I want to push on that actually for a second, because I think that's actually a really important point, right? And it plays into a theme that I talk a lot about in investing. Authoritarian regimes are incredibly powerful, and they're also incredibly fragile.
Yeah.
Right. So, and they have to operate under an environment of constant paranoia, which creates its own dynamic of push and pull, right? You foment nationalism because you want to garner support for the great leader, but the great leader often recognizes that if the forces of nationalism escape, that he can no longer control them, and can be forced into a decision or an action that may have long-term negative ramifications for him personally or her personally. That tends to elude people when they think about this, idea of permanent leadership. And so what I'm hearing on Xi is very similar to that effectively he is simultaneously very robust, and it goes again to the language that is used, right? Reform is constantly in play, which basically means purges, right? So anyone who if there becomes any question as to your loyalty, it becomes very easy to say, this prior accepted wink nod act is anti-China, it is a betrayal, and you're a traitor to the country, and the forces of corruption have tied you up, and we're going to execute you as a corrupt individual, right? That's easily accepted. That language is easily accepted. But exactly as you're describing, there's also some grumblings because Xi has extended China in a way, trying to push itself forward on the global stage. And this has made it relatively easy for the U.S. administration under Trump to begin building a coalition of resistance to Xi in a way that hadn't existed, right? Certainly under the Obama administration, and I am very apolitical on this. I just want to be very clear, but I tend to be somewhat of a single issue individual right now because I think the threat from China, if unchecked, is so important. And I would just highlight that while people are very focused on this, in particular, where we hear negative language from the Europeans, you mentioned that Vietnam is actually relatively positively disposed. In part, that's because they're sitting in the shadow of the Middle Kingdom, right? They see it firsthand. So is that a reasonable interpretation of some of the differences? Those who are directly in China's environment, the Taiwans, the Singapores, the Vietnamese, et cetera, the Koreans, are perhaps more positively disposed to the behaviors that we're seeing coming out of the Trump administration than those who are protected by Russia, for example, just in terms of physical distance.
Yes, I think that's actually a very reasonable interpretation. And when you talk about, like, let's say North Asia to Southeast Asia, all of those countries have their own complexities. But generally speaking, I think that's a very accurate assessment, because they definitely see China as a much bigger threat, a much bigger risk than they do the United States. This doesn't mean, one of the things when you try to talk about this doesn't mean that they're all fans of Trump. This doesn't mean that they all love the United States. You're going to get variations within the leadership, within the country, within the military, things like that across all those countries. They absolutely, I think it's very fair to say, they all view China as a much bigger risk and a much bigger threat. Now, they're going to work with the United States, whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, whether it's Obama Jr., they're going to work with the United States in different ways that kind of fit their overall preferences. But they absolutely do view China as the bigger risk. Vietnam, as an example, Vietnam is actually surprisingly, and I did not realize this, Vietnam is probably the most pro-United States country literally in the world. And this is not just a broad sentiment, but it is a deeply and strongly held sentiment, and this is true over a long period of time. And I, as an American, I went to Vietnam, and I was like, well, everything I'd been ever seen was, Ken Burns documentaries growing up. And you go there, and there's actually a deep love, and America is incredibly popular in Vietnam. Now, the government, they want to work with the United States, especially in areas like the South China Sea. They also don't want to become beholden to the United States. So in things like infrastructure projects like ports, they try to say, we're going to give this part to the Japanese, we're going to give this part to the French, we're going to work with the Americans here. And yeah, we'll probably have a Chinese construction company maybe involved or something like that. So they're absolutely hedging, but they absolutely at the same time view China as the greater risk and say, we want more friends that will help us as a bulwark against China. And so the challenge for the United States, whether it's Trump, whether it's Biden, is to say, how do we work with countries in unique ways to deal with China? Because I very much have a similar thought. That people ask me, well, why are you so concerned about China? It's not crazy at this point in history, in my opinion, to say China could usher in a period of 200 to 500 years of global authoritarianism. They're clearly trying to do that in a lot of lesser developed countries, supporting authoritarians. So I don't think that's a crazy scenario.
So I unfortunately agree with that. I think I think it would probably be less of a time period. And ironically, I'm a little bit more concerned about how the U.S. responds to the authoritarian response, right? So we've been through this in the last 100 years, where we had a similar dynamic with the Soviet Union, where we chose to take a somewhat principled stance of how do you respond to an authoritarian power by embracing the diversity of a democracy. And I've been recommending that people read Matt Stoller's book Goliath to think about the 180-degree view of the actions of FDR and those who followed him relative to the way that an Amity Shlaes might have presented it in The Forgotten Man, right? So there's a story in terms of a reduction of corporatism that I think is very important to understand in this dynamic. But I think the biggest risk that I see in the United States is actually that we respond to this challenge by becoming more authoritarian ourselves. And so I think that's part of the subtext that you're actually referring to as well. You're saying it's not necessarily that China would capture those areas and become the dominant force. It's that in the response, America becomes more authoritarian itself. Is that a reasonable interpretation of what you're saying?
Yes, I think it is, definitely. And just to give you a couple of examples, like when you use the Cold War analogy, one of the things, just to give you two specific challenges, is a lot of people are saying, well, we need to work with Europe and things like that. And we do. At the same time, a lot of the Cold War institutions that we think of, for different reasons, for primarily technical reasons, they simply aren't going to work when we're talking about China. Okay. We're talking about a different theater. I mean, literally on the other side of the world. We're talking about a bunch of governments in Asia that have all kinds of different government structures. Okay, even democracies. The South Korean government is going to operate very differently than the Indian government for a lot of reasons. So we need to think, I think much more creatively internationally how this works. And when we talk about that, how that works domestically, I think what is important is how do we, and these are difficult conversations, and there's nuance, there's complexity. Just to give you one example of this, I'm a big believer in international education. Okay, that's really been most of my professional career, working in China, working in Vietnam as a professor. That's very important to me. I'm a big fan of that. At the same time, allowing Chinese graduate students from the PLA into American research labs, to me, is probably a risk that we need to seriously reconsider. And the Trump administration has said we're not going to allow that. And so how do we say these are acceptable risks, these are valid risks, and put that through some type of vetting process to make sure that, that we are saying, hey, China wants to use our strengths of openness against us. So how do we remain open? How do we remain a liberal democracy, but also recognize that China is trying to use those strengths as weaknesses against us? And we just need to be very cognizant of those debates. And so that's why when we get back to this idea of information warfare, what they're trying to do is sow discord so that we're not saying, what's a reasonable trade-off here? How do we manage these specific issues?
I think that's really well said. And I think it goes, again, to kind of my core fear that we will choose to react too late and then have to effectively institute a very aggressive policy, right? And so to me, it's very clear on stuff like this. When you're talking about it, you want to make sure that you are aware of the potential to frame something in the context of racism, right? Are you reacting because somebody is Chinese, or are you reacting, or ethnically Chinese, or are you reacting because of the risks that they represent from a national security standpoint, right? And to think about it in that matrix, I think, is really important. And unfortunately, the forces inside the United States on both sides, right? So in both situations, have reacted from actions to immediately point and say, oh, this is authoritarian, in the case of shutting down transportation between the United States and China under the Trump administration as it related to the coronavirus, or cutting back on the ability for Chinese students to attend university in the United States. These are often interpreted as authoritarian actions. It's not at all clear that that's the right lens to apply them, right? We need to be cognizant of those two battles. The second thing that I think you mentioned, Europe, right? And so I would challenge our European listeners to put this in the context of exactly what you described, the difference between the Cold War between Russia and the United States, where Europe was effectively a peninsula trapped in between the two, right? And so the US emphasis on putting troops on the ground in Europe, encouraging the defense of Europe, the attention that was paid to Europe was very necessary. And of course, on the other side of the globe, we had less capacity to do that because we didn't have the relationships, we didn't have those ties. And so violence broke out in Southeast Asia and more broadly across that region, right? Today, we're almost in the opposite scenario, where Europe largely feels secure because of a weakened Russia or Soviet sphere. And as a result, they're playing, at least from my perspective, Europe is playing a kind of interesting game where they enjoy the fact that China is tweaking the United States, that China is challenging the United States. This feels positive because it allows Europe to be in a position of relative influence where it can treat the United States and China as potential equals, where they're bartering with both, right? What's the risk to Europe in doing that? One, does that seem like a fair assessment? And two, how should we think about this if you are a European? How should you think about interpreting the challenges that the U.S. is facing in terms of, trying to thwart the actions of China in Asia in particular, from the perspective of a European? I'm looking at Merkel, for example, right, with Germany, which has very strong and deep supply chains with China, and is very much resisting any attempt to exclude China from, the dynamics of a true globalist situation.
So the way I always try to cast the debate is if I was to describe an action to you with essentially no name attached, would you think that's a good or a bad action? Okay, and if we apply that same basic idea to China, if I was to say let's not consider it against the United States. Let's just say this is what China is doing. Is that good or bad, and how should you react? I think a lot of times, a lot of people take the type of approach that you said and said, well, compared to the United States, we're in between, something like that, rather than saying this is what is taking place. How do I respond based upon the absolute description of what is taking place. And so just as an example, if you were to say, well, the United States is going to suck up every piece of data about every European, that would clearly be problematic. That's why they did things like GDPR to localize data collection on Europeans. Google has to abide by European law and, erase data, localize data storage for Europeans, things like that. But when it comes to China, for instance, for some reason with Huawei, nobody cares about those rules. Okay. And so the best way to think about it is this good? Is this right? Regardless of who does it, regardless of who does it. And so I think that is the place to start, especially for Europeans, that it's like, instead of saying, let's have a China standard, what is the standard that we expect to exist? And then is China meeting that standard? And I think that's a much better way to think about it than relative to this, compared to this country, et cetera, and say, is China meeting the standard that we expect a global corporation, a developed country to treat their citizens and to treat foreign citizens?
Yeah, I think that's, colloquially, that's known as whataboutism, right? So, China is doing this. Well, what about what America does, right? I think your standard is quite a good one, which is just to say, is this acceptable behavior? Does this meet my standards, right? Forget the realpolitik for a second and say, does this meet my standards? I think that's a pretty reasonable way to look at it. Let's veer for a second. Do you have much of a perspective on the relationship between Russia and China?
So Russia and China most definitely have a frenemy type of relationship. They absolutely cooperate quite deeply in some areas, and they absolutely are maybe not hardened enemies, but they definitely are enemies in other areas. Just to give you an idea, we know that Huawei is hiring Russian hackers and hiring Chinese hackers to move to Moscow. Okay, and they're recruiting in the hacker community all throughout Eastern Europe. That's definitely a concerning behavior, and we know that other Chinese companies are doing that. There's cooperation in those areas. We also know, however, that there are clear areas where they are enemies. In the South China Sea, Vietnam actually hired a Russian oil and gas firm to help them drill for oil, basically knowing that China would not, take provocative actions against a Russian shipping and drilling. Okay, and Russia had no problems doing that. Okay, so there's definitely times, and Russia has played that role in India as well. So that it's a very interesting and unique relationship. I don't know of any other geopolitical relationship like it, where they will work so closely in some areas and then fight so hard and take such opposing stances in other areas. I don't know quite how to describe it. It's such a unique relationship.
Yeah, so the way I think about it is, in all candor, I think Putin has been by far the best player in the game. And it is very clear to me that Russia cannot allow China to rise and become a global superpower anywhere close to what the United States is, for the very simple reason that they share way too much of a border. They share, they occupy the same continent, right? And again, this goes to the strengths of the United States effectively being the clear dominant power on its own continent. Russia, I think, is playing a game where they recognize that the single best path to strength for Russia is actually a path that causes extraordinary weakness in China. That they've effectively goaded China into acting too soon, or maybe at the only time that China viewed it as possible, because of the population pressures that China is ultimately going to face. So I agree with you. It's a very unique position, but it also, to me, speaks to the risks for the Europeans, which is, if ultimately by trying to weaken the United States in these negotiations, they run the risk of strengthening Russia long term. And that becomes quite concerning for a peninsula on the Eurasian continent, right? It's one of the longer term plays that I think I've seen. I'm not sure Putin gets to see it out, but just from an age standpoint, but it's a remarkable feat of geopolitics in my view, that what he's pulled off. If I think about one of the points that I just raised, this dynamic of demographics in China, how much of the nationalism in China do you think is influenced by the conditions on the ground, where the economy itself is suffering from a shortage of domestic aggregate demand, right? Just simply by virtue of negative population pressures. And then on the second front, the dynamics associated with family formation, children, et cetera, with low marriage rates, an excess of men, although that's somewhat debatable. There was a fantastic piece recently put out by India challenging some of the statistics on population in China. How do you think about that influence? Because you were directly exposed to Chinese youth through your role in education at Peking University.
I think it is absolutely a major factor. And I think a lot of this issue of aggregate demand, which you're talking about, I think is probably the biggest problem right now in the Chinese economy. Everything that you're seeing out gets to this issue. The statistic I read recently, which just, and you knew it was, but somebody calculated it, is debt to GDP this year, I think, is expected to go up by 25 to 30%.
Yeah, this is a Michael Pettis quote, I believe.
Exactly. And I mean, just a staggering number. I mean, 25 to 30%. And I think one of the things is that the Chinese household is really hitting the limits of what they can actually accomplish simply by borrowing and plowing more money into real estate. I had students that directly out of school, they would get married. Both families would pool their resources, and they would drop, $750,000 in China, into an apartment. Okay. And their families might still live in poorer villages and things like that, but they would pool their resources, and that is essentially the family asset. And so at some point you essentially exhaust that pool of liquid savings, and everything is in real estate. And I think, some of the research has shown that something like, some absurd number, I'm probably going to get it wrong because I read this a couple months ago, but I want to say it was something like 75% of new home sales were second or third homes in China. And so when that is taking up such a percentage of income, and when you add in the interest rates and just what the debt servicing costs are, I think debt servicing costs are something like 20% of GDP now on an annual basis, whereas in Japan there's something like 1% of GDP or something like that, and in the United States it's a little bit higher than Japan, but it's not much. So when it's taking that percentage of annualized output, that just kills aggregate demand. You just cannot. There's just no money left over to continue servicing the debts and raising output. Then you throw in these demographic challenges that you're talking about. Chinese population has probably been falling for maybe as much as a decade at this point. Yeah. And I think the working age population started declining 3 to 4 years ago. I forget the exact time, but it was a couple years ago. And there's just almost no room for aggregate demand output, and I think you're really starting to see that hit hard.
So I think that's right, and I would actually highlight. So the data I've seen suggests that the Chinese labor force began to contract around 2011. So roughly 9 years ago. The population a little bit after that because of the aging of the population. So I think you flipped the two. So I think it's about a decade for the shrinking of the labor force, and 3 to 4 years. The population, 3 to 4 years ago, the population began shrinking. The labor force is really the critical issue, though, ultimately, because that's what drives your capacity for production And it also goes back exactly to this point, where you're talking about the pooling of resources to buy real estate, right? So when you have this 8-4-2-1 sort of phenomenon, you have an element of a Ponzi that the older generations can provide the resources to the younger generation. But unless you're able to address the dynamics of the negative population pressure, that one then has nowhere else to go. And paradoxically, if you choose not to have children, all right, so many years ago, I got into an argument with a leading luminary in the U.S. in terms of their views on China, where they were highlighting the dynamics of, well, China is the competitor. They spend 40% of their household income educating their children. And my point was very straightforward, which is, well, if you spend 40% of your income educating your children, how many children, you're one child, how many children can you have, right? You can't have two because you can't spend 80%, right? And what happens to your standard of living if you have none? Well, you suddenly have 40% more disposable income. And so that becomes an extraordinary resource in terms of your standard of living. We've seen this play out in Japan. We've seen this play out. We're seeing it play out very actively in China. Michael Pettis does a wonderful job of highlighting the countercultural aspects of his students' population, the underground bands, et cetera. A lot of that is going away as the party begins a crackdown on that type of behavior, that type of, quote unquote, seditious behavior. But that math can't be argued with, right? You can't grow aggregate demand for real estate when your population is falling at the rate that China's population is falling. And so ultimately, it becomes a very Pyrrhic situation. I would highlight for those who are watching, one of the reasons for the strength of the Chinese yuan has been the relative rise of Chinese interest rates. If that's actually a credit phenomenon, if that's beginning to price in the risks of a substantial depreciation, then we're getting a very false signal from the markets in terms of that dynamic. And I, of course, would lay some of that at the hands of passive index investing that is plowing money into China for a variety of reasons. But those are very real risks that China encounters, a bit of a sudden stop where you hit that type of moment. Does that feel fair to you?
No, I think that feels very fair. Exactly. And, that's why, the entire, really for at least the past decade, probably 20 years with slightly different dynamics, has been, they have to increase basically monetary injections. From say 2000 to 2012 or so, it was all about FX injections. Then it became increasingly about credit. Imagine a couple of years in a row where debt to GDP is growing by 25 to 30% a year. You can only do that a few years in a row where before the whole thing blows up at those numbers. And the only reason that they're able to keep that level of financial flows inward, either from domestic savers or foreign investors in different capacities, is through having that interest rate wedge. You can see very clear dynamics when the U.S. was raising interest rates. That definitely put and you saw the potential that interest rate differential was going to drop to 1 or 2. You really could in the Chinese financial markets see that pressure. There just wasn't the interest in moving into Chinese assets. Well, now that China is having, let's say, a 4%, 3.5% interest rate, and U.S. is at zero. It's not zero, but let's say it's zero. All of a sudden, China's breathing a sigh of relief. Yeah. That's a big help, and so that's how you get that level of foreign inflow.
Well, and that foreign inflow, just to be very clear, again, this goes back to the interest service that you were referring to, right? In many situations, you could interpret that capital inflow, which thinks that it's pursuing better investment opportunities because of the interest rate spread. It's actually Ponzi-like in its characteristic, right? It's providing the income that can then be used, the cash flow that can be then used to service that debt. And so you become extremely subject to what Michael Pettis has referred to and written as the volatility machine, right? Where ultimately you become dependent on those inflows in order to service the debt. If those inflows stop, not only are you incapable of servicing the debt, but then the resulting policy choices cause a rapid outflow of that capital. And so it feels to me that we're in that process. I think this is one of the hidden sources of collateral risk, hidden in the way that a giant elephant is hidden in your living room, right? But it is a very clear issue. How would China react to that type of crisis? What would you expect to happen based on your knowledge?
So many years ago, one of those defining moments for how I viewed China is I was having a conversation with an individual who has profound depth of knowledge about the Chinese economy, and we were talking, and I asked them about the possibility of a crisis-like event, and they said, "Oh, there's not going to be one." And at first, I was puzzled. I was like, "Well, look at the numbers. I mean, the numbers are crazy. I mean, how can you say there's never going to be a crisis?" And they said, "Look, if there ever is a crisis in China, that is effectively the defining moment of the entire 21st century. Okay, I mean, that will be D-Day, the Bolsheviks in Moscow, 1989 rolled into one. I mean, that will be the defining event of the 21st century." And so Chinese leadership knows that. And so they will literally move heaven and earth, print money, start a war, anything to prevent that from happening. One of the things that I think is not well understood outside of a relatively small number of people outside of China is Xi, more than anything. I think that the number one thing that explains why Xi is behaving the way he is he is absolutely obsessed with making sure that China does not have a 1989 style event. Okay. And so if that means invading India, do it. If that means, doing whatever he has to do to keep that FX surplus going so that he can, keep real estate rising and other things happening, so be it. Okay. And so this tells us that in a way that there's a lot more desperation in the system, and that they're also going to continue to make the policy choices that simply keep the plate spinning. So is it possible that there could be a Chinese style, a Chinese crisis? It is possible. In my decision tree, the way I think of it is that would be the last possible outcome of any series of events, that there are no other options. Okay, because if you ask, is there a check that Xi is unwilling to write? No, he will write any check to keep the plate spinning.
And the ultimate plate at the end of the day is Xi himself, right? So if you are faced with a situation, exactly as you said, where you can rule for another 20 years or you can die because you've been poisoned, right? The only plate you care about is avoiding the poisoning. And so there's significant resources that a state the size of China can put behind the desire for self-preservation of a single individual. It's one of the key risks, by the way, and I fault Trump largely for introducing the language into the United States, but it's one of the reasons you don't prosecute your outgoing leaders, right? You don't have that sort of retribution because you're setting up the conditions similar to Berlusconi in Italy or elsewhere where you just say, all right, I'm not leaving, right? If I'm going to go to jail or I'm going to be killed, et cetera, I do everything I can, break all rules of decorum. When I look at that with China, I think that's right. And I always encourage people to think about the fact that Xi is so worried about the 1989 event, the perestroika, the fall of the Berlin Wall, et cetera, that there's a very real risk that actually I would say it's almost a certainty that he's actually repeating the choices that Stalin made that prevented that from occurring much earlier in the USSR, right? So he's repeating the actions of the constitutional change, the Great Purges, et cetera. We've seen this across the leadership, right? The Bao Xilai, et cetera. We've seen the dynamics of a purge. Quarters of impeding organization are eliminated. When you think about that type of dynamic, ultimately the solution is you either face outside, if you continue to face the outside world under this component where capital is flowing in and allowing you to meet your obligations under that actually is, at least in my analysis of the historical record, that's where you create the conditions for a massive devaluation, right? So the Soviets kept their currency stable from the period from 1929 all the way through the end of 1936, and then devalued their currency by 80%. It feels to me that's a very real and very plausible scenario for a China.
Yeah, I mean, I would just empirically, so big picture, absolutely. And I can tell you empirically, the people I talk to that are still doing business and doing international transactions, they basically, the only companies out of China that can get US dollars are major SOEs. And when you do that, it's typically 6+ months before you get paid.
Yeah.
And so I think that speaks to the issue of what you're talking about, that there is such dollar tightness that would a devaluation type of scenario be completely out of the realm of possibility? I don't think it's the most likely scenario within the next, let's say, year. Is there incredible dollar tightness? Absolutely. Could we rule something like that out? I don't think you can.
Well, and I think ultimately that becomes a challenge, right? Because a devaluation of 10%, for example, would actually exacerbate the dollar tightness. It would begin that process of capital flight. Nobody would ever want to put those, because you're going to be repaid in RMB, right? When you buy a Chinese bond. And so even with an interest rate of 3.5%, a 10% devaluation wipes out anything that you would have made and sets the stage for you to say, I'm never going to do that again, or at least not significantly. I think the risk of it is very high. And so you postpone and you postpone and you postpone that, all the while the signal that is being received by the market under a pseudo basket system is increasingly flawed. And that's what forces that massive devaluation, right? It's the kid who doesn't admit to their parents, that they, were drinking the night before, and then, they deny, and then all of a sudden it's this tearful confession, and, it's the dam breaks, and everyone's like, okay, let's try to enter into an era of forgiveness. That's harder on the geopolitical stage, right? The desire to refuse to admit these problems is huge. And ironically, that then creates doubt amongst the investor class, right? Because you recognize this has to be done. The longer it's delayed, the more it looks like the claims that it has to be done are flawed, even as it becomes more and more compelling.
No, I think that's exactly right. And that's why I don't think it's any coincidence that how they've essentially valued the RMB is essentially a reverse dollar index, so that people can feel very confident in saying, oh, well, it's basically just a dollar index. And that gives that false signal that you're referring to.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So, Chris, you've come back to the United States now. You don't fully know what's next, but what is on the horizon, and how are you going to continue to monitor China without revealing direct sources? But how do you plan on staying involved in this sphere going forward?
So a lot of the work that I'll be carrying on is related to this data that we've revealed so far. So we actually have significant amounts of additional detail and additional data that we'll be working with and revealing. So that's one of the primary ones, and I think it's really interesting that it is such direct data about what China is doing, that whether it's in a security sphere or whether it's in corporate intelligence and financial markets, there really is, I think, just unprecedented levels of detail there, and I think probably in some ways gives you a better idea of what is going on than if you were there. But I absolutely at this point have a good network of contacts that I'm able to talk to on a regular basis to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. Is this what you're hearing from people that are working in a lot of these different industries?
Well, this kind of becomes the ultimate work from home type environment, right? Now you've made the connections, and you have the flow of data that allows you to continue to monitor this and maintain awareness of how this is developing. You've been on Real Vision a number of times. I'd love to have you back in 6 months to catch up on what you're doing with the database and how you're working. But in the meantime, people can follow you primarily on Twitter. You're extremely active on Twitter. You make me look tame. What's your handle, and what should people that are interested in following you be prepared for? Are there?
So I try to laugh at things. I try to balance. I do think the world needs to laugh a little bit. Especially in 2020. I saw today that scientists had discovered signs of life on Venus, and I tweeted out that that's the good news. The bad news is that it's just a bunch of sunburned murder hornets about to invade the United States. So I try to provide a good mix of on Twitter and on my blog both serious analysis and lighthearted stuff, because if there's ever a time I think the world needs to laugh a little bit more, I mean, it is the craziness that is 2020.
So I tend to agree with that, and I look forward to more people following you and engaging in that laughter. I would encourage people to think about this exactly from this dynamic. Why are we hearing this stuff? Why are we hearing it now? And embrace some of the absurdity, not from the standpoint of nihilism, but just from a recognition that in many ways we're being played on all sides, and to be aware of those perspectives and think about how you want to comport yourself individually in that framework. So you've done an amazing job, Chris, and welcome back to the United States. I'm so pleased to have you locally. When I make regular trips down to Los Angeles, I look forward to sharing a nice dish of pho with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike, and I look forward to enjoying that bowl of pho.
Take care, Chris.
Take care, Mike.